Unlike many peoples of Western Europe, the Russians inherited from the medieval world a complex and layered image of Byzantium. It was not a simple memory and not a one-sided tradition. It consisted of knowledge, emotion, admiration, criticism, and eventually ideological struggle. Among educated Russians, this view rested on a substantial awareness of Byzantine history, preserved through chronicles and translated historical writings that circulated in the Slavic world for centuries. Byzantium was not seen as a distant empire with only occasional importance. Its past was treated as something closely connected to Russia's own destiny. In the medieval Russian understanding of history, events from Byzantine life framed major moments in Russia's historical memory, as if the story of the empire and the story of Rus' belonged to the same larger world. More importantly, Russians inherited a whole set of judgments about Byzantium that shaped how they felt about it. On one side, there stood a deep and lasting devotion to the empire that had given them Christianity and much of their religious and cultural inheritance. Constantinople, the imperial capital, remained in Russian imagination a holy and radiant city, a spiritual center, a place of wonder and authority. On the other side, there persisted a steady mistrust of Byzantine motives, especially of imperial diplomacy, which often seemed clever, self-interested, and manipulative. After the Council of Florence, this mistrust became even sharper in certain circles. Some thinkers in Muscovy began to argue that the Greeks had lost their right to lead the Orthodox world, and that the true center of the faith had passed to Moscow. That double response, attraction mixed with unease, did not end with the Middle Ages. It survived into later centuries and reappeared in new forms in the writings of Russian churchmen, rulers, philosophers, and historians. As Russia changed, the meaning of Byzantium changed with it. Sometimes Byzantine history was used as a warning. Sometimes it was praised as a source of greatness. Sometimes it was treated as the foundation of Russian civilization. At other times it was condemned as a burden from which Russia needed to escape. From the 17th century onward, Russian attitudes toward Byzantium moved through several broad phases. In the 17th and early 18th centuries, references to Byzantium were often practical and argumentative. Church leaders and political reformers reached back into Byzantine history in order to defend their own policies. In the 19th century, Byzantium entered the great intellectual struggles about Russia's identity, its historical path, and its relationship with Europe. Then, by the late 19th century, Byzantine studies in Russia began to take shape as a serious academic discipline, with scholars who approached the subject not as ammunition in an ideological dispute, but as a field of research in its own right. The 17th century marked a widening of the historical outlook of educated Russians. One clear sign of this was a renewed concern for the Greek Orthodox world, especially as churchmen from the Ottoman Empire came to Russia in search of assistance, protection, and support. Their presence brought Greek influence more directly into Muscovite society and stirred conflicting responses. Some saw in this contact a return to spiritual authority and ancient models. Others saw danger, corruption, and foreign interference. These disagreements shaped how Russians thought about their Byzantine inheritance. A pro-Greek current within the Russian Church, strongly associated with Patriarch Nikon, argued that spiritual authority must stand above secular power. To support this position, Nikon appealed to Byzantine precedents, especially to old formulations that define the relationship between emperor and patriarch within the Christian Commonwealth. For his supporters, Byzantium served as a model of sacred order and ecclesiastical authority. But there was also a fierce reaction against these ideas. Those later known as the Old Believers rejected Nikon's reforms, especially his effort to reshape Russian religious practice according to Greek standards. Their resistance was not only ritual or theological, it was also historical and symbolic. In their eyes, the Greeks themselves had lost purity. They revived the doctrine that Moscow was the third Rome and insisted that the true centre of orthodoxy had passed northward long ago. To them, the Greek world was no longer the guide it claimed to be, because it had been weakened, compromised, and polluted by foreign domination and internal decay. A few decades later, Byzantine history was again put to use, this time by Peter the Great, though in a very different spirit. Peter did not look to Byzantium with reverence. He approached it as a ruler determined to transform Russia through reform, discipline, and westernization. What he found in Byzantine history was less a source of inspiration than a storehouse of negative examples. To him, the downfall of the Byzantine Empire offered a lesson in how a state could be ruined by internal disorder, disobedience, betrayal, and military weakness. Nor did he show much sympathy for the Byzantine Church. Peter's comments on Byzantine monasticism were especially harsh. In his view, religious excess, especially the unchecked spread of monasteries, had drained the strength of the empire and weakened its capacity to defend itself. He treated Byzantine piety not as a noble inheritance, but as a symptom of political and social decline. Under Peter, then, Byzantine history was used polemically, not to glorify the past, but to justify the reshaping of Russia into something harder, more disciplined, and more modern. These uses of Byzantine history in the 17th and early 18th centuries were not especially original as historical thought. They were selective and openly purposeful. Particular events or institutions from the Byzantine past were extracted and used to defend a reform, attack an opponent, or offer a warning. It was only in the 19th century that Russian thinkers began to attempt a wider interpretation of Byzantium as a whole. This happened during the great disputes between the Westernizers and the Slavophiles, especially in the intellectual world of Moscow in the 1830s and 1840s. These debates, shaped by European Romanticism and German philosophy, revolved around Russia's mission, its civilizational identity, and its proper relation to the West. In those arguments, Byzantium became an important witness. Some summoned it for the defense, others called it for the prosecution. The Westernizers argued that Russia belonged to European civilization and should continue along that path. The Slavophiles emphasized Russia's distinctiveness and believed that the Russian tradition, rooted in orthodoxy and communal life, possessed a moral and spiritual depth, lacking in the rationalist and legalistic cultures of the West. One of the harshest voices among the Westernizers was Pyotr Chardaev. He argued that Russia's cultural sterility was due in large part to the miserable inheritance it had received from Byzantium. In his view, the Byzantine legacy had cut Russia off from the living fellowship of Christian Europe. What he found especially damaging was the tradition of a church subordinated to imperial power. For Chardaev, this was not merely an institutional flaw. It was a sign that Russia had inherited from Byzantium a distorted form of Christianity, one too closely tied to authority and too far removed from genuine moral and intellectual development. Yet not all Westernizers judged Byzantium so harshly. One of their most important historians, Timofey Granovsky, offered a much more balanced defense. He argued that Russia had received from Constantinople the best part of its national inheritance, above all its faith and the earliest foundations of education. In his view, Byzantium had introduced young Russia into the wider family of Christian peoples. Granovsky also insisted that the study of Byzantium deserved serious scholarly attention, and he believed that Slavic scholars in particular had a duty to investigate a civilization to which they owed so much. In his approach, admiration was joined to criticism, and ideology gave way, at least in part, to a genuine historical curiosity. In this sense, his work pointed beyond the older arguments and toward the emergence of Byzantine studies as a disciplined academic field. The Slavophiles, for their part, also displayed a complicated attitude toward Byzantium. Their general tendency was to value the Byzantine inheritance, especially in religious and cultural matters. But even among them, the judgment was not entirely straightforward. Ivan Kirievsky, for example, contrasted the contemplative and artistic culture of Byzantium with what he saw as the rigid legalism and rationalism of the Latin West. For him, the Greek Christian world preserved a more inward and organic form of spiritual life. But Alexei Khomyakov, perhaps the most important Slavophile, theologian, and philosopher, offered a more mixed picture. He praised Byzantium for its theological tradition, its monastic achievements, and its missionary role in shaping Russia. At the same time, he criticized the Roman character of its law and state structures. To him, the Byzantine Empire remained too deeply bound to legal formalism and state machinery. He felt that Roman political forms had constricted the living spirit of Christianity within the empire. In this way, even a thinker profoundly attached to orthodoxy could admire Byzantium spiritually, while distrusting its institutional and political side. As Russian interest in Byzantium grew after the middle of the 19th century, it increasingly took on a political dimension. There had already been some connection between Byzantine themes and Russian foreign policy in earlier generations. Campaigns against the Ottomans and dreams of influence in the Balkans had encouraged the idea that knowledge of Byzantine history was useful for understanding the fate of the Orthodox East. But it was Pan-Slavism that forged the strongest connection between Byzantium and the so-called Eastern question. In the later 19th century, especially in the works of Nikolai Danilevsky, a powerful new argument took shape. Russia, he claimed, had a historic right to Constantinople. He imagined a future in which Russia would lead a federation of Eastern and Southeastern European peoples, restoring in some form the political space once occupied by the Eastern Roman Empire. In this vision, Byzantium was not merely a dead civilization to be studied. It was a geopolitical inheritance awaiting completion by Russia. These ideas reached one of their most intense forms in the thought of Konstantin Leontiev. He was not easy to classify. He shared the hostility to the West found in many nationalist currents, and he also cherished the dream of Russian power at Constantinople. Yet he was no simple Slavophile and no ordinary pan-Slavist. He did not believe in easy Slavic unity, and he opposed the liberation of the Balkan Slavs if it meant their assimilation into the modern, liberal, and levelling currents of Europe. His idea of Byzantium was highly personal and deeply imaginative. For Leontiev, Byzantinism meant a distinctive union of autocracy, hierarchy, social inequality, and orthodox mysticism. He saw this not as a defect, but as a great civilizational strength. In his eyes, Byzantium represented a complex, disciplined, and beautiful form of life that had once sustained Russia and might still protect it from modern decay. He believed that the deepest structures of Russian society were still shaped by this Byzantine spirit, as if the empire had left behind not just rituals or institutions, but a whole nervous system running through Russian civilization. This interpretation gave the Byzantine inheritance a decisively positive value. For Leontiev, as for Danilevsky and many nationalist thinkers, Byzantium was not a fallen example or a regrettable detour. It was one of the great sources of Russian distinctiveness and power. Yet not all late 19th century thinkers agreed. Vladimir Solovyov offered one of the strongest and most passionate rejections of Byzantium in all Russian intellectual history. Opposed to narrow nationalism and convinced that Christian unity required reconciliation with Rome, Solovyov condemned Byzantium as a false Christian empire. In his view, the Byzantines had betrayed the universal calling of Christianity. They had clung too tightly to external forms of worship, while failing to transform public and political life in a truly Christian spirit. They had allowed schism to deepen. They had surrendered the church to the domination of the state. What others called sacred order he denounced as a form of Caesaropapism. For Solovyov, Byzantium was not the guardian of Christian civilization, but one of its great failures. He saw in it an empire that claimed to be Christian while remaining in many ways pagan in its political instincts and moral structure. This was a far more severe judgment than the one offered by Chadaev, because Solovyov made Byzantium central to his understanding of why Christian history had gone wrong in the East. None of these 19th century figures, with only limited exceptions, approached Byzantium in the way a modern scholar would. Their importance lies elsewhere. They helped make Byzantium a major subject within Russian public life. They used it to think about Russia's destiny, its spiritual identity, its political future, and its relation to Europe. Through them, Byzantium became a central symbol in discussions of nationalism, church history, foreign policy, and philosophy. But a genuine academic tradition required something more rigorous. It required a turn away from sweeping historical myths toward close work with texts and documents. It required scholars ready to devote themselves to a highly specialized field. And it required universities and educated society to recognize Byzantine studies as a distinct discipline rather than a branch of polemics or national ideology. Those conditions were finally met in the 1770s of the 19th century. Yet the ground had been prepared much earlier. Between the late 18th century and the middle of the 19th, important work had already begun. Scholars had started collecting and publishing Byzantine sources relevant to Eastern Europe. Others tried to illuminate the early connections between Byzantium and Russia. During this preparatory period, figures such as Bayer, Müller, Schlutzer, Stritter, Krug, and Kunik laid essential foundations. One major step was the publication of a multi-volume collection of Byzantine texts relating to Eastern Europe. Another was the effort to persuade the learned world that Byzantium remained one of the great unsolved problems of history. Kunik, in particular, played a major role in championing this field. He insisted that the Russian people had received their faith from Byzantium, and that this faith had given them the strength to endure centuries of struggle and eventually free themselves from Islamic domination. He also believed that much of Russian history reflected the history of Byzantium itself. At the same time, he recognized the main weakness of the field in his day. There were too few trained Byzantinists, and those who did exist were often interested only in the parts of Byzantine history that touched directly on Russia. That narrow, applied character of Russian Byzantine studies continued until the late 19th century. The scholar who truly established Byzantine historical studies in Russia as a major discipline was Vasily Vassilyevsky. Trained first as a classicist and influenced by the great traditions of European scholarship, he began teaching Byzantine history in St. Petersburg in 1870. Over the following decades, he transformed the field. He produced important studies on Byzantine social and administrative history, hagiography, and Russo-Byzantine relations. He helped give Byzantine studies a respected place within Russian intellectual life. He founded an influential scholarly journal devoted to the field. And he raised the international standing of Russian Byzantinism so significantly that leading Western specialists could no longer ignore Russian scholarship. Two themes stood at the center of his work. One was the history of relations between Russes and Byzantium, a topic inherited from earlier Russian scholarship. The other was the agrarian and social history of the Byzantine Empire. This latter interest was especially important because it connected Byzantine studies with the broader 19th century concern for social and economic development. Through that line of inquiry, Russian scholars helped open new ways of understanding the internal life of the empire beyond dynasties, court politics, and theology. A second giant of the field was Fyodor Uspensky. He was not only a scholar, but also an organizer and builder of institutions. He played a major role in developing Byzantine studies in Odessa, later directed the Russian Archaeological Institute in Constantinople, and led major expeditions in the region. Even after the Russian Revolution, he tried to preserve what remained of the scholarly tradition he had helped to strengthen. His range was broad. He wrote on social and economic history, religious and philosophical thought, and the relations between Byzantium and the Slavs. On the last of these themes, he was influenced in part by earlier nationalist and Slavophile currents, especially in his belief that the settlement of the Balkans by the Slavs had profoundly affected the empire's social development. He argued strongly that Slavic, communal structures had played an important role in shaping agrarian and legal forms in Byzantine lands. Yet even though he was devoted to scholarship, Uspensky could still draw political lessons from the past. On the eve of the great crises of the early 20th century, he suggested that Russia could not stand aside from the struggle over the legacy of the Bosphorus. For him, as for many of his contemporaries, the study of Byzantium still carried implications for Russia's role in the East. Between 1870 and 1917, Russian Byzantine studies developed several striking features. Their scholarly quality became exceptionally high, in some areas matching and perhaps even surpassing the work of specialists elsewhere in Europe. Their strongest fields were social, administrative, and economic history, together with the study of Russo-Byzantine relations. They also benefited greatly from the contribution of the great theological academies, especially those of Moscow and St. Petersburg, which provided training, language skills, and a serious engagement with ecclesiastical sources. This combination of philological rigor, institutional support, and wide historical curiosity made late imperial Russia one of the principal centers of Byzantine scholarship in the world. The Soviet period brought a dramatic break, followed by a slow revival. After Uspensky's death in 1928, Byzantine studies in Russia entered a period of eclipse. For roughly a decade, serious work in the field was sharply reduced. The discipline lost ground, and scholarly continuity was badly damaged. But beginning in 1939, a gradual recovery started to take shape, and after the mid-1940s, it gathered new strength. Specialized groups were formed within academic institutions. New publications appeared. Older journals returned after long interruption. Through the efforts of committed scholars, Byzantine history once again became a recognized and accessible field for the educated public. Soviet Byzantinists inherited from their predecessors two central themes that continued to dominate the field. The first was the social and economic history of the Byzantine Empire. The second was the history of relations between Byzantium and medieval Russia. Both were now studied through Marxist categories and assumptions. Soviet scholars focused heavily on the development of feudal relations in Byzantium, regarding feudalism as an appropriate framework for understanding the empire's social and economic structure. They examined the history of Byzantine cities, the transformation of social classes, and the changing forms of landholding and labour. Another major question concerned the Slavic invasions and settlements in the Balkans and their effect on the empire's internal development. On this issue, Soviet Byzantinists generally accepted that earlier views had sometimes gone too far, but they still maintained that Slavic communal practices and customary law influenced the development of the Byzantine rural commune. In their interpretation, the Slavic presence in the Balkans contributed to the breakdown of older social forms and to the rise of feudal relations. This Soviet scholarship differed in method and ideology from the work of the late imperial period, but it also showed continuity. The great Russian interest in Byzantium had always been shaped by two persistent questions. One was how Byzantium functioned internally as a society, a state, and a civilization. The other was how Byzantium shaped Russia and how Russia, in turn, interpreted that inheritance. Those two questions remained central across centuries of changing political systems and intellectual fashions. By the modern era, then, Russian attitudes toward Byzantium had passed through many transformations without losing their essential tension. For some, Byzantium was the sacred source of faith, culture, political form, and historical legitimacy. For others, it was a warning against theological compromise, excessive ritualism, political oppression, or civilizational stagnation. For some, it represented a living inheritance that justified Russia's special mission in the Orthodox East. For others, it was the very reason Russia had failed to join the fuller life of European civilization. And for scholars, once the field matured, Byzantium became something larger than praise or blame. It became a world to be studied on its own terms. That may be the deepest continuity in the Russian encounter with Byzantium. The empire was never merely foreign, never merely admired, and never merely rejected. It remained too close for indifference. Russia had received too much from it to dismiss it, yet had struggled too long with its legacy to accept it, without reservation. Across centuries of argument, devotion, appropriation, and criticism, Byzantium remained one of the great mirrors in which Russians tried to see themselves. The direction taken by Soviet Byzantine scholarship makes one thing especially clear. For Russian historians, the relationship between Byzantium and Rus would never become a minor subject. It remained central because it belonged to a much larger and more difficult question: how one civilization influences another without simply absorbing it. No serious study of medieval Russia can deny the immense reach of Byzantine religion, literature, political ideas, art, and ceremonial life. The imprint was everywhere and it was deep. Yet that influence was never a one-sided force acting upon a passive people. The Russians did not simply receive Byzantine culture intact and reproduce it without change. They answered it creatively. They accepted certain elements, reshaped others, and set some aside altogether. The true story lies in that encounter, in the tension between inheritance and transformation. Any broad statement about Byzantine influence has meaning only if it can be tested again and again in concrete examples, in liturgy, law, chronicles, architecture, language, political ritual, and spiritual thought. Soviet scholars, with their strong interest in historical process and social development, were well placed to investigate this pattern. Their continued work on the Byzantine and Russian world also showed that the strongest moments in Russian Byzantine studies had always drawn life from two sources at once: loyalty to an older scholarly tradition and a willingness to push further through engagement with the work of historians in other countries. One of the clearest places to see that larger cultural process at work is in the story of the effort made in the 9th century to create a Slavic Christian culture in the heart of Europe. It was an attempt to build a church that would speak to the Slavs in their own language while standing under the authority of both Constantinople and Rome. In the short term, that experiment appeared fragile and endangered. In the long term, it proved to be one of the most important turning points in the history of the Slavic world. From Moravia, it moved south and east. It passed into the Balkans and eventually into Russia. It shaped the religious imagination, language, literature, and intellectual life of entire peoples. At the center of this story stand two brothers from Byzantium, Cyril and Methodius. The recorded history of Slavic Christianity in the vernacular begins in the year 862. In that year, envoys arrived in Constantinople from a ruler in Central Europe, Prince Rastislav of Moravia. His state included Moravia, Slovakia, and parts of what is now Hungary. Rastislav had strong reasons for reaching out to Byzantium. Moravia was under pressure from its powerful neighbours, especially the Franks and the Bulgarians, and he wanted an alliance with the empire. But his second request would prove far more important than any diplomatic arrangement. He asked the emperor to send a Christian teacher who knew the Slavic language of his people. Christianity was already present in Moravia before this moment. Missionaries from the German church, especially from Salzburg and Passau, had already preached there during the first half of the 9th century. It is possible that Irish missionaries had also been active in the region somewhat earlier, though the evidence is uncertain. What mattered most to Rastislav was that the Christian message reaching his land came through foreign clergy whose language and loyalties were not his own. He had only recently broken free from dependence on Louis the German, and he understood that German missionaries could easily become instruments of Frankish influence. If Moravia was to preserve its political independence and develop its own cultural identity, it needed priests who could preach and teach in the language spoken by the people themselves. The Byzantine government recognized both the practical and the strategic value of this request. It agreed to a political understanding with Moravia and chose two remarkable men to lead the mission: the brothers Constantine and Methodius from Thessalonica. Both were already distinguished figures in the service of church and state. Their careers had made them unusually well suited for such a task. Constantine, who would later become famous under his monastic name Cyril, had studied under Photios and had taught in Constantinople. Methodius had served as a governor in a Slavic-speaking district of the empire and had known the Slavs from close experience. Both had also turned toward religious life. Methodius became a monk. Constantine was ordained priest. Before being sent to Moravia, the brothers had already taken part in major diplomatic and missionary efforts, including a mission to the Khazars. Yet their greatest advantage in the Moravian case was simple and decisive. Being natives of Thessalonica, a city surrounded by Slavic-speaking populations, they knew the language of the Slavs intimately. Before they departed, Constantine carried out the act that would define his historical greatness. He created an alphabet for the Slavs. This script was designed for a Slavic dialect of the region around Thessalonica and was meant to give the Moravians access to Christian texts in a form they could understand. Scholars have long debated the precise relationship between the two early Slavic alphabets, Glagolitic and Cyrillic. The balance of evidence suggests that the first script created by Constantine was Glagolitic, while Cyrillic emerged somewhat later, likely among the disciples of the mission in Bulgaria, where Greek letter forms were adapted more directly to the Slavic language. Whatever the later development, the achievement of Constantine was extraordinary. The new script was not a mere borrowing. It was an original and carefully designed tool for rendering Slavic speech in written form. With it, he translated selections from the Gospels for liturgical use, beginning with the opening words of the Gospel of John. At that moment, a new literary language was born. Modern scholars call it Old Church Slavonic. It was based on a spoken Slavic dialect of Macedonia, but it was shaped by Greek models and first used in an ecclesiastical context. In the 9th century, the different Slavic languages had not yet diverged to the point of mutual unintelligibility. So this new written form could be understood far beyond its place of origin. It could speak not only to Moravians, but later to Bulgarians, Serbs, and Russians as well. Over time, it became one of medieval Europe's great international languages, and the sacred tongue of the Orthodox Slavic world. In that sense, Constantine was more than a missionary. He was the founder of Slavic literary culture. In the autumn of 863, the Byzantine mission arrived in Moravia and was received with honour by Rastislav. The brothers immediately faced two urgent tasks. First, They had to educate a native clergy able to preach and worship in Slavic. Second, they had to provide a liturgy in the language of the people. Some Christian formulas had already been translated into Slavic, from Latin before their arrival, including texts used for baptism, confession, the Creed, and the Lord's Prayer. These earlier efforts may have been useful to them, but the liturgical offices had still been celebrated in Latin, a language unknown to most of the population. Constantine set about translating the church offices into Slavonic. Matins, the hours, vespers, compline, and the Mass were soon made accessible in the new language. Exactly which rite formed the basis of these translations has long been discussed. Some evidence points strongly to the Byzantine liturgy, especially in the terminology used. Other evidence suggests that Roman liturgical forms may also have been translated and adapted, perhaps because Latin worship had already been established in Moravia through earlier Western missionaries. It is quite possible that both traditions found their way into the emerging Slavic Church of Central Europe and that a mixed liturgical practice gradually developed. What matters most is that the service of God was now being made available in the mother tongue of the people. From the Byzantine point of view, this was entirely natural. The Eastern Christian world had long accepted the use of many languages in worship. Armenians, Georgians, Arabs, and others praised God in their own speech. But in the Latin West, liturgical uniformity had become a much firmer principle. Latin was seen as the proper language of Christian ritual, and Moravia lay within the sphere of the Western Church. It was therefore inevitable that the Frankish clergy in Moravia viewed the work of the Byzantine brothers with alarm. Their hostility was strengthened after Rastislav was forced into submission to Louis the German in 864. What had seemed a bold cultural experiment could now easily be cast as a foreign intrusion. Yet the papacy did not immediately reject the mission. In fact, its response was at first strikingly favourable. 5 years after their arrival in Moravia, Constantine and Methodius travelled to Rome after being summoned by Pope Nicholas. They arrived at a moment when papal policy made their case attractive. Rome was trying to secure its influence over the Slavic world and had recently enjoyed success in Bulgaria. The possibility that the Slavs might enter the orbit of the Roman Church gave the mission of the two brothers a clear strategic value. The new pope, Hadrian II, had several reasons to welcome them. Their missionary results were impressive. Their learning and holiness were widely admired, and they were supported by important rulers in Central Europe, including Rastislav of Moravia and Kokil of Pannonia. There was still one difficult issue. The brothers celebrated the liturgy in Slavonic. Was Rome prepared to approve this Western innovation? Or would it sacrifice the chance to guide Moravian and Pannonian Christianity for the sake of linguistic uniformity? Hadrian chose the path of accommodation. He endorsed the work of Constantine and Methodius, ordered the Slavonic liturgical books to be placed on the altar of Santa Maria Maggiore, and authorized the liturgy in the Slavic language to be celebrated in major Roman churches. This was a remarkable moment. What had begun as a Byzantine mission to Central Europe was now being blessed in Rome itself. Soon afterward, however, Constantine fell gravely ill. As death approached, he entered monastic life and took the name Cyril. In 869 he died in Rome and was buried in the Basilica of St. Clement. Before his death, he urged Methodius not to abandon the mission to the Slavs, even if it meant giving up forever the quiet life of the monastery. That final appeal reveals something essential about both brothers. They were men of contemplation and men of action, drawn toward prayer but compelled by mission. For Methodius, obedience to his brother's last wish meant continuing a work that was about to become even more difficult. Methodius returned to Central Europe with papal approval behind him. As Archbishop of Pannonia and papal representative among the Slavs, he continued building a vernacular Christian culture. He translated more of Scripture, trained clergy, and strengthened the liturgical life of the mission. But the ground beneath him was unstable. The East Frankish and Bavarian clergy, whose rights had been damaged by his new position, used their political influence to move against him. He was arrested, accused of violating episcopal authority, condemned by a local synod, and held in prison for more than 2 years. Only in 873, after Pope John VIII learned the full extent of the affair, was Methodius released. Even then, the mission did not regain secure footing. Although John VIII continued for a time to support Methodius, Rome gradually became less willing to defend the Slavonic liturgy, if doing so meant a major confrontation with the Frankish Church. After Methodius died in 885, the support that had once come from Rome collapsed. His disciples were arrested, expelled, or even sold into slavery. The work of Cyril and Methodius in Central Europe seemed ruined. The Slavonic liturgy appeared close to extinction, and the new Slavo-Byzantine culture looked like a failed experiment. Yet, this was only part of the story. The mission did fail in its original political setting, but its cultural and spiritual legacy proved far more resilient than its enemies expected. In some parts of Central Europe, especially in Bohemia and Croatia, the Slavonic liturgical tradition endured for generations. In Dalmatia, the Glagolitic heritage survived for centuries and even left traces in later religious life. Still, the main future of the movement no longer lay in Moravia. It now shifted decisively southward, into Bulgaria. That transfer was one of the great turning points in Slavic history. The Bulgarian ruler Boris had accepted Christianity from Byzantium in 864, almost at the same moment that Cyril and Methodius began their work in Moravia. By 870, Bulgaria was firmly tied to the Eastern Church and to Byzantine civilization. Yet Boris and the Bulgarian elite understood the danger of complete dependence on a Greek clergy. They wanted the benefits of Byzantine religion and culture without surrendering national autonomy. The arrival of the expelled disciples of Methodius offered an ideal solution. Here was a Christian tradition, shaped by Byzantium, yet carried in a Slavic language. It could give Bulgaria a path into Orthodox civilization, without forcing it into complete Greek control. The disciples were welcomed warmly. The greatest among them was Clement, a Byzantine Slav whose role in the development of Slavic Christian culture stands second only to that of Cyril and Methodius themselves. Boris sent Clement to Macedonia, where he spent decades preaching, teaching, translating, and training clergy in Slavonic. He eventually became bishop and helped make the region one of the leading centers of Christian culture in Europe. Ohrid, in particular, became a cradle of Slavonic Christianity in the Balkans. There, the work of the Moravian mission was not merely preserved, it was expanded and deepened. At the same time, another center of literary culture grew at Preslav, the Bulgarian capital in the northeast. Under the patronage of Simeon, Boris's son, this school became a major force in the spread of Slavic letters. It was probably there that the older Glagolitic script gave way in many contexts to the simpler Cyrillic alphabet, which was more visibly shaped by Greek writing and easier to use. Over the next century, the literary output of Preslav was immense. Works from the Greek fathers, chronicles, encyclopedic texts, and even writings on poetics were translated into Slavonic. This was still, for the most part, a culture of translation and adaptation, rather than one of large-scale, original composition. But its importance cannot be overstated. It opened the treasury of Byzantine, sacred and secular learning to the Slavic world. Through Bulgaria, that inheritance would pass to Serbia and to Rus, nourishing Eastern European civilization for centuries. When the work of Cyril and Methodius is viewed in the widest sense, its significance lies in both its creative force and its power to bring worlds together. In an age when relations between East and West were growing more strained, the brothers tried to unite three elements that would later drift apart: Byzantine faith, Roman authority, and Slavic language. They were loyal sons of the Byzantine Empire and never ceased to belong to its spiritual and cultural world. Their training reflected the revival of learning in 9th century Constantinople. Methodius embodied the monastic and administrative strengths of Byzantium. Cyril embodied its intellectual brilliance. They also carried within them the Byzantine vision of a universal Christian order, an empire that was understood as an earthly image of divine rule. That universalism shaped their missionary outlook. Their mission to the Slavs was not a narrow national project. It was an attempt to draw new peoples into a sacred commonwealth without erasing their language or identity. At the same time, their work was welcomed, at least for a moment, by Rome. The later history of church division has often distorted modern perceptions of this period. In the 9th century, despite tensions and rivalries, the relationship between Old Rome and Constantinople was not yet one of permanent rupture. Rome still held immense prestige in Byzantine eyes, and the Bishop of Rome still occupied a place of honour in the Christian world. The support given by the papacy to the Slavonic mission was therefore not a strange accident, but part of a world in which cooperation between East and West was still possible. It was not Rome itself that destroyed the Slavonic Church in Central Europe, so much as the political and ecclesiastical pressures of the Frankish clergy, driven by a desire for control and uniformity. For the Slavs themselves, the gift brought by Cyril and Methodius was immense. What began as a mission to preach in one people's language grew into a civilizational transformation. The liturgy became available in a speech that was rich, flexible, and intelligible. Scripture was translated into the same sacred tongue. The immense world of Greek theology and Byzantine learning became accessible through Slavonic translation. A door had opened. The Slavs were no longer dependent on hearing sacred truth only in the language of others. They could now receive it in words close to their own speech and imagination. This achievement also carried a powerful idea. A people whose language was used in worship could see itself as honoured before God. The use of the vernacular in the liturgy sanctified not only words, but community. The language of a people became a vessel of grace. The people themselves could now be counted among the great nations who praised God in their own tongue. That conviction appears in the writings connected with the Cyrillo-Methodian tradition. It is reflected in the defense of the vernacular against those who insisted that only a few sacred languages were acceptable. It is also expressed in the poetic language of the early Slavic literary tradition, where peoples without letters in their own language are described as spiritually impoverished, while the Slavs are called to hear the divine word with their own minds and hearts. This idea had lasting consequences. It helped create a vision in which a nation could be consecrated without becoming isolated, and in which cultural identity could coexist with universal Christianity. Every people, in this understanding, had its own gifts and its own place within the larger family of the Church. This principle would shape the religious imagination of the Orthodox Slavs for centuries. In Rus, it helped produce a culture deeply indebted to Byzantium, yet capable of originality and self-awareness. Russian writers, while conscious of belonging to a civilization formed by Byzantine Christianity, increasingly understood that their own newly converted people also had a place and a mission within the Christian world. The impact of this legacy was not limited to rulers and writers. It reached ordinary believers as well. Because the Slavs of Eastern Europe received Christianity in a language close to their own speech, they could follow at least some of what they heard in church. The liturgy itself became a source of deep and lasting inspiration. The Eastern liturgy was one of Byzantium's greatest creations, rich in symbolism, poetry, movement, chant, and theological depth. When the Russians first encountered it in Constantinople, they described it as something beyond ordinary human experience, as though heaven and earth had come together. Translated into Slavonic, that same liturgy entered the heart of Slavic Christianity. Its hymns, its Eucharistic drama, its visual world of icons and frescoes, and its overwhelming sense of sacred presence shaped the spiritual life of whole peoples. That is why the achievement of Cyril and Methodius cannot be measured only by the success or failure of their mission in Moravia. Their lasting importance lies in something much larger. They made it possible for the Slavs to enter Christian civilization without surrendering their language. They linked Byzantine spiritual culture with Slavic speech. They showed that the universal church could speak in many voices. Their work created a literary language, opened access to scripture and theology, strengthened the idea that language itself could be sanctified, and left behind a tradition that transformed Bulgaria, Serbia, and Rus. What seemed at first a threatened and fragile experiment became one of the great foundations of Eastern European civilization. In one of the earliest Russian historical writings, there is a passage that captures something essential about the arrival of books and learning in the Slavic world. It describes how, in the time of Prince Yaroslav in the 11th century, efforts were made to bring translated texts to the people. The chronicler pauses to reflect on what this meant. Books, he says, are like rivers that nourish the world. They teach wisdom, guide the soul, and offer comfort in times of sorrow. Through them, a person enters into conversation not only with wise men, but with the divine itself. Such words may sound familiar, echoing common ideas found across medieval literature. Yet beneath that familiar tone lies something genuine. There is a sense of wonder in the realization that knowledge, once distant and inaccessible, has now been placed into the hands of ordinary people, and in a language they can understand. The writer gives credit to the rulers of his land, especially Yaroslav and his father Vladimir, who brought Christianity to Rus. In praising them, he focuses on their role in spreading literacy and making translated texts available. Interestingly, he does not mention the deeper origins of this cultural transformation. The names of Cyril and Methodius do not appear in that particular moment, even though their work made such developments possible. This silence is not due to ignorance of their importance. Elsewhere, the same tradition clearly acknowledges that the Slavic alphabet, literature, and scholarly life all trace back to those Byzantine missionaries. Their memory was preserved and honoured. The absence of their names in this passage reflects not denial, but a shift of focus toward local rulers who carried that legacy forward. The story of Slavic literacy in Rus unfolds across a crucial period, beginning with the official conversion to Christianity at the end of the 10th century and reaching its first full expression in the 11th. It was during this time that literature began to emerge and that a sense of collective identity started to take shape. Yet the roots of this transformation reach further back, into a more uncertain and fragmentary past. The first known encounter between the people of Rus and Christianity occurred in the 9th century. Byzantine sources describe how a raid on Constantinople was followed by an unexpected turn. Soon after, Christian influence began to take hold. By the late 9th century, there were signs of an organized church presence, including bishops sent from Constantinople. This early Christian structure did not remain stable. It appears to have been disrupted by a return to pagan traditions, driven by political shifts and the arrival of new ruling groups. Even so, Christianity did not disappear. A community persisted, especially in Kiev, gradually growing throughout the 10th century, There are scattered glimpses of this early Christian presence. Some envoys from Rus, involved in agreements with Byzantium in the mid-10th century, were already Christians. A church existed in Kiev, serving a community of believers. Princess Olga, a key figure in the ruling dynasty, was baptized during a visit to Constantinople. Not long before the official conversion of the entire realm, there were even individuals who suffered for their Christian faith. These moments suggest continuity rather than interruption. They point to a slow and uneven process in which Christianity took root over more than a century. What remains unclear is how this early Christian community functioned on a practical level. It is likely that priests, texts, and liturgical practices were already present in some form. The rapid development of church organization after the official conversion suggests that earlier foundations must have existed. It is difficult to imagine a sudden transformation without preparation. There must have been clergy capable of preaching, scriptures that could be understood, and a form of worship that resonated with the population. Yet, direct evidence is limited. Only small traces remain. There are hints that written Slavonic was known, perhaps through translated documents. There are suggestions that the liturgy may have been conducted in a language accessible to the people. Archaeological finds and linguistic clues offer fragments of a larger picture. None of these pieces alone provide certainty. Together, they suggest that the Slavic literary and liturgical tradition had begun to spread into Russia before the official conversion. The most plausible explanation lies in cultural connections with other Slavic regions. The Eastern Slavs were not isolated. They had ties with both Western and Southern Slavic peoples. Through these connections, priests and books could have moved across regions. Bulgaria, in particular, played a major role as a centre of Slavic Christian culture. It is likely that the tradition established there, rooted in the work of Cyril and Methodius, reached Ruses gradually over time. Constantinople itself may also have contributed by preparing clergy and texts for missionary activity beyond its borders. After the conversion under Vladimir, this process accelerated dramatically. The establishment of Christianity as the official religion created an urgent need for a functioning church structure. The use of the Slavonic language became not only practical, but essential. It allowed the message of Christianity to be understood by a wide population and helped integrate religious life into everyday experience. One of the clearest signs of this transformation appears in the account of Vladimir's efforts to educate the next generation. He ordered that children from noble families be gathered and taught reading and writing. The reaction of their families, described as grief and resistance, suggests that this was a significant and unfamiliar change. These early schools likely formed the foundation of an educated elite, capable of producing the first works of native literature. The language of instruction was almost certainly Slavonic. There is a telling detail in the chronicler's description. He quotes a biblical passage about the deaf hearing and the mute speaking. In its original context, the words refer to spiritual awakening. Here, they are applied to the spread of literacy and the introduction of sacred texts in a language people could understand. The phrase used to describe these texts carries a double meaning. It refers both to written words and to the body of translated scripture and liturgy in the Slavic language. This connection reveals how closely literacy, religion, and language were intertwined. The same idea appears in earlier sources connected with the mission of Cyril and Methodius. In those accounts, similar biblical imagery is used to describe the moment when people first hear sacred words in their own language. By echoing this tradition, the chronicler places the reforms of Vladimir within a larger historical pattern. The introduction of Slavonic learning in Rus is presented as part of a broader movement that began elsewhere, but found new life in this northern land. A second wave of cultural development came under Yaroslav. He is described as a lover of books, someone who read constantly and valued learning. Under his rule, scribes were gathered to translate text from Greek into Slavonic. The result was a growing body of literature, much of which was preserved in the Cathedral of St. Sophia in Kiev. This effort expanded the intellectual horizon of the society. It made theological works, historical narratives, and other writings accessible to a wider audience. The exact origins of these translators remain uncertain. Some were likely local, trained in the new schools established earlier. Others may have come from Byzantine or Slavic lands. Bulgaria, again, was a likely source of influence, especially after its own political upheavals. There may even have been contributions from Western Slavic regions, including Bohemia, where the Cyrillo-Methodian tradition had survived in various forms. The literary culture that emerged was therefore not purely local. It was shaped by a combination of influences. Texts from different regions circulated and were adapted. The distinction between what was translated in Rusis and what was imported from elsewhere is not always clear. The written Slavic language remained relatively uniform across regions for a long time, making it difficult to trace origins precisely. What can be said with confidence is that the cultural world of Kievan Ruses was part of a broader Slavic and Byzantine network of exchange. This network also included connections with Central Europe. Texts related to Czech saints and traditions found their way into Ruses. The veneration of figures like Wenceslas and Ludmila reflects these ties. Such connections show that the legacy of Cyril and Methodius was not confined to one region. It moved across boundaries, linking different parts of the Slavic world. Within native Russian writing, the influence of this tradition can also be seen. Early texts reveal an awareness of belonging to a larger Christian community, while also expressing a growing sense of local identity. The idea that a people could have its own role within the universal church, while maintaining its language and traditions, is a recurring theme. This concept, rooted in the earlier missionary movement, helped shape the intellectual and spiritual outlook of Rus. After the early 12th century, the evidence becomes less continuous. The tradition did not disappear, but it becomes harder to trace in detail. By the late Middle Ages, however, interest in the figures of Cyril and Methodius re-emerges. Writers begin to revisit their legacy, sometimes blending historical memory with imaginative reconstruction. Stories appear linking their work directly to Russes, even when such connections cannot be historically verified. These narratives reflect a desire to claim a share in a prestigious past, as well as a genuine respect for the cultural transformation they had initiated. At the same time, the deeper legacy of their work remained visible in practice. One striking example is the mission of Stephen of Perm in the 14th century. Like Cyril, he learned the language of the people he sought to convert. He created an alphabet for them, translated religious texts, and established a local church structure. His work followed the same pattern, bringing faith through the vernacular, making it accessible and meaningful. His achievements were recognized and celebrated, even though the long-term survival of his linguistic reforms was limited. The enduring influence of Cyril and Methodius can also be measured in the preservation of their memory. Many of the surviving manuscripts of their lives come from Russia. Liturgical texts honoring them were included in early church calendars. Hymns praised their work in bringing the faith into the language of the Slavs. Their legacy was not only historical, it was woven into religious practice and cultural identity. The transformation they began was profound. It allowed entire societies to engage with Christianity in their own language. It created a literary tradition that connected different regions while preserving local identity. It shaped the intellectual and spiritual life of Eastern Europe for centuries. In Ruses, this legacy found fertile ground. It contributed to the rise of literature, the development of education, and the formation of a cultural identity that balanced inheritance with originality. As this story draws to a close, one uncertainty remains difficult to ignore. Any attempt to understand the legacy of Cyril and Methodius in the Slavic world inevitably leads back to language. And yet, without the tools of a trained linguist, it is impossible to fully capture the depth of that transformation. The Old Church Slavonic language stood at the very centre of this historical shift. It was not merely a tool of communication, but the foundation upon which an entire cultural and intellectual tradition was built. This language reached the lands of Russes through different channels. It carried influences shaped earlier in Moravia, but even more strongly, those developed in Bulgaria. Over time, it became the primary medium of religious expression. Through it, sacred texts were read, prayers were spoken, and theological ideas were formed. It also became the basis of written culture, not only in religious works, but in historical and literary writing as well. As centuries passed, this language did not remain separate from everyday speech. It blended gradually with the spoken tongue, shaping it from within. Even later, when literary trends shifted, elements of this older language returned again and again, enriching vocabulary and thought. There was a cost to this development. The reliance on a Slavic literary tradition may have created a certain distance from the classical world of antiquity. Knowledge of Greek, which opened the door to ancient philosophy and science, remained relatively limited in medieval Ruses. Yet this limitation should not be overstated. The language that shaped Slavic culture had itself been formed in close connection with Greek. Through translation and adaptation, it carried much of that intellectual heritage into a new setting. It allowed the people of Ruses to create a body of literature that was both deeply rooted in their own experience and connected to a wider world of ideas. Among all the elements of this tradition, one proved especially enduring. The Christian liturgy, with its rich imagery, poetic rhythm, and emotional depth, left a powerful impression on those who experienced it. According to later accounts, it was the beauty of worship in Constantinople that helped inspire the conversion of Rus. When that same liturgy was rendered in the Slavic language, it became even more powerful. It spoke directly to the people, not as something distant or foreign, but as something familiar and alive. Even in later periods of hardship and ideological change, this tradition did not disappear. It continued to express a deeply rooted spiritual identity. The importance of this legacy can still be felt when reflecting on the broader meaning of the Cyrillo-Methodian tradition. At its core lies a sense of hope and renewal. The translation of sacred texts into a language people could understand was more than a practical decision. It carried a symbolic weight. It meant that knowledge was no longer hidden. The word was no longer sealed. What had once been distant became present. This idea can be expressed through a powerful image. In earlier times, language had divided humanity. The story of Babel describes a world fractured into many voices, unable to understand itself. But the tradition that followed brought a different vision. It suggested that diversity of language need not mean division. Instead, it could become a bridge. The ability to hear sacred words in one's own language was seen as a restoration, a kind of renewal of unity. The spread of literacy and translation was understood not only as education, but as transformation. This sense of renewal appears again and again in the language used to describe these events. Images of barren lands becoming fertile, of silence turning into speech, of blindness giving way to sight. These are not only poetic expressions. They reflect the belief that something fundamental had changed. A new world had opened, one in which understanding was no longer limited to a few, but extended to entire peoples. By the modern era, the importance of this transformation had become even clearer. The work of Cyril and Methodius continued to attract attention, not only for its historical significance, but for the questions it raised. Scholars explored the complexity of their mission, the challenges they faced, and the long-lasting effects of their work. Their efforts were no longer seen as a simple episode in missionary history, but as part of a much larger process of cultural encounter. That encounter can best be understood as a meeting between two forces. On one side stood the traditions of Byzantium, shaped by centuries of political, religious, and intellectual development. On the other side were the Slavic peoples, with their own cultural needs and aspirations. The result was not a simple transfer of ideas from one to the other. It was a dynamic process marked by both tension and creativity. The figures at the center of this process were not only religious teachers, but also representatives of a broader system. They carried with them the authority of an empire, the intellectual heritage of a civilization, and a vision of universal order. Their mission was shaped by both spiritual goals and political realities. To spread the faith also meant to extend influence. To teach a new language of worship also meant to shape the identity of entire regions. This dual role explains much about their success. They were able to adapt to local conditions while remaining connected to a larger tradition. They understood the importance of language, not only as a tool, but as a symbol of belonging. By creating a written form that reflected the sounds and structure of Slavic speech, they gave these communities a voice of their own. The reaction of the Slavic peoples to this transformation was not passive. They did not simply receive what was given. They reshaped it, adapted it, and made it their own. The adoption of a liturgical language became a statement of identity. It suggested that each people had its own place within the broader Christian world. Not inferior, not secondary, but distinct and meaningful. This idea found expression in many forms. Writers described their people as newly chosen, not in the sense of replacing others, but in joining a wider community. They drew on familiar religious images to explain their position. One of the most powerful was the idea that those who arrived later still shared equally in the reward. It was a way of asserting dignity while remaining within a shared tradition. In this sense, the legacy of Cyril and Methodius goes far beyond language or literature. It helped shape a way of thinking about identity itself. It showed that unity did not require uniformity, and that diversity could exist within a common framework. It offered a model in which cultural expression and spiritual life were deeply connected. Looking back, the encounter between Byzantium and the Slavic world appears as both a challenge and a response. It was a moment of tension, but also of creation. From that encounter emerged something new, a synthesis that would define the cultural history of Eastern Europe for centuries. A second and even more revealing example shows that the Slavs did not stop at claiming a place for themselves within the Christian world. They also tried to defend that place through a far broader and more ambitious vision of history. In the tradition surrounding Cyril and Methodius, the rise of Slavonic worship was not presented as a small local reform or a useful missionary adjustment. It was understood as something far more profound. It was described as part of the sacred drama of human salvation itself. One of the clearest expressions of this idea appears in a letter attributed to Pope Hadrian II, addressed to the rulers Rastislav, Svatopluk, and Kochel. In that message, the use of the Slavonic liturgy in Moravia and Pannonia is approved, and the argument used to justify it reaches back to one of the most powerful moments in Christian memory. The text invokes the story of Pentecost, the descent of the Holy Spirit upon the apostles in the form of tongues of fire. That choice is deeply significant. It suggests that the appearance of Slavonic worship, and with it the written form of the Slavic language, was not simply an administrative innovation. It was seen as something like a renewal of Pentecost itself, a fresh outpouring of divine grace through language. The same idea appears, in a more poetic and less direct form, in the early Slavonic prologue to the Gospel book, where Christ is described as gathering nations and tongues. The wording is brief, but its meaning is wide. The coming of sacred scripture into the language of the Slavs is presented as part of a universal movement, a drawing together of peoples once separated. The message is not only that the Slavs now possess the gospel in their own speech, it is that their language has entered sacred history. Their voice has become one of the voices through which divine truth is proclaimed. Yet the thinkers who shaped this tradition pushed the argument even further. In one of the most striking passages of the medieval Russian chronicle, the meaning of Slavonic writing is set against the much older story of human division. Before the account of Cyril and Methodius, the chronicler begins with the story of the world after the flood, the division of the earth among the sons of Noah, and the building of the Tower of Babel. Humanity, once united, is scattered. One people becomes many peoples. One language becomes many languages. Confusion enters the world, not only in speech, but in the life of nations themselves. The chronicler then turns from that ancient fracture to the story of the Slavs and to the work of the two Byzantine brothers. The arrangement is not accidental. By placing these episodes together, he invites the reader to see a deeper pattern. The old division of Babel had shattered the original unity of mankind. But through the coming of the Slavonic liturgy and letters, something of that damage was being repaired. The gift of language, once a sign of separation, had become once more a vehicle of communion. In that sense, the work of Cyril and Methodius was understood as an extension of Pentecost, and Pentecost itself as the answer to Babel. This is what gives the Slavic response its remarkable scope. The argument is no longer limited to the dignity of one people or the rights of one language. It becomes an interpretation of history itself. The Slavs are not merely another group entering Christianity at a late hour. They are participants in the healing of the divided human world. Their vernacular tradition is no longer defended only as useful or legitimate. It becomes part of the great restoration of unity brought by the Holy Spirit. The idea that Pentecost reverses Babel was not new. It had long existed in Christian thought and was already present in the liturgical tradition of the Eastern Church. It appears in the hymns of Pentecost and in the writings of major Greek fathers. But what is distinctive here is the way that older idea is applied specifically to the Slavic world. In this form, it becomes an original development within the tradition shaped by Cyril and Methodius. It allows medieval Slavic writers to place their own cultural awakening inside the universal history of salvation. The Slavs are no longer standing at the edge of a story told by others. They now belong within its centre. This method of reading history through scripture must be handled carefully. Medieval writers often quoted the Bible in dense and layered ways, and it is not always possible to recover every shade of meaning they intended. But in this case, the pattern is unusually clear. Again and again, the same elements appear together. The liturgy in Slavonic, the miracle of Pentecost, the memory of Babel, and the idea that sacred language restores what human pride and division once shattered. The structure is too deliberate to be accidental. The same approach can be taken one step further. A third and final example reveals an even more immediate and powerful way in which medieval Slavic authors celebrated the legacy of Cyril and Methodius. Here, the question is not simply the place of the Slavs within Christendom, or their role in sacred history. It is something more intimate and more exalted at the same time. These writers began to present the coming of Slavonic scripture and worship as part of the transformation of creation itself, as a sign that the kingdom of God was breaking into the world. To express this vision, they turned to the prophet Isaiah. Two lines in particular became central. One speaks of the day when the deaf will hear the words of a book. The other promises that the tongue of the mute will be made clear. In the original biblical setting, these words describe a divine renewal, a moment when blindness, silence, and estrangement give way to understanding and praise. In the Slavic tradition, these images were given a new and specific meaning. The deaf were those who had not yet heard sacred truth in their own language. The mute were peoples whose tongues had not yet become vessels of worship. The book was no longer only the hidden word of God waiting to be opened. It was the scripture now translated into Slavonic. It was also the liturgy, the prayers, and the whole body of sacred writing made available in the language of the people. These images appear in several works linked to the Cyrillo-Methodian world. Sometimes one verse is used, sometimes the other, and in some cases they are deliberately brought together. When that happens, the meaning becomes especially rich. The gift of Slavonic letters is no longer described only as instruction. It becomes healing. A people once unable to hear now hears. A voice once unable to speak now praises. Conversion is understood not merely as a change of belief, but as the opening of the senses, the awakening of the whole human person before God. That is why the wider setting of these lines in Isaiah matters so much. They belong to a passage filled with joy, release, and renewal. The wilderness is no longer barren. The desert blossoms, the weak are strengthened, the blind see, the deaf hear, the mute speak. Everything in the image moves from desolation to abundance, from silence to song, from brokenness to glory. When medieval Slavic writers used these verses to describe the coming of sacred language to their people, they were making a very large claim. They were saying that this cultural and religious transformation was not a minor event. It was part of the renewal of the world. In that vision lies perhaps the strongest defense ever offered for the work of Cyril and Methodius. Their achievement was not praised only because it served the church effectively or strengthened a people's sense of identity. It was praised because it seemed to reveal something about the nature of divine action in history. God does not speak to humanity in one language alone. He enters many tongues. He lifts up peoples not by erasing their voice, but by giving that voice a sacred purpose. The Slavonic liturgy, in this understanding, was not just permitted. It was a sign of grace. And so the heritage of Cyril and Methodius was exalted by medieval Slavic writers in the highest terms available to them. They saw it as a new hearing of the divine word, a new speech born from silence, a new flowering where there had once been only dryness and distance. What had begun as a missionary undertaking in Central Europe came to be understood as an event with universal meaning. In the Slavic imagination, it belonged not only to national history, but to the great movement by which confusion gives way to understanding, estrangement to communion, and the dry ground of the world to joy. The story of the Bogomils in the Balkans is far more than the history of a small medieval sect. At first glance, it may seem like the tale of a remote religious movement that appeared in a limited corner of southeastern Europe and then disappeared into the past. Yet anyone who looks at it closely quickly realizes that Bogomilism opens the door to much larger questions. It touches theology, philosophy, politics, society, literature, and even the long cultural memory of the Balkan world. It also stands at the crossroads between East and West, linking older religious ideas from the Near East with later medieval movements that would shake parts of Europe. For that reason, the Bogomils deserve to be seen not as a marginal curiosity, but as one of the most revealing religious movements of the medieval age. For theologians and historians of ideas, Bogomilism offers one of the clearest medieval examples of a dualist vision of existence. It presented the world as a place divided between two opposing forces, one good and one evil, and built an entire way of life upon that conviction. For historians of the Balkans, it became part of the religious, political, and social inheritance of the region. Its influence reached into popular belief, into apocryphal literature, and into the tensions that shaped medieval, Bulgarian, and Byzantine society. For scholars of Western Europe, it is also important because it may help explain how older forms of dualist religion moved westward and eventually influenced groups such as the Cathars of southern France and the Patarenes of Italy. If that wider connection is accepted, then the Bogomils become a key link in a much longer chain, one that stretches from the teachings of Mani in Mesopotamia to the violent suppression of dualist movements in the Latin West, centuries later. At the heart of the Bogomil worldview stood one of humanity's oldest and hardest questions. Where does evil come from? Every religious tradition that insists on the perfection of God eventually faces the same problem. If God is all-powerful and wholly good, why does the world contain pain, corruption, cruelty, decay, and death? How can a perfect creator be related to a broken creation? This question has challenged philosophers and believers in every age, and the answers given to it have often divided entire civilizations. One broad answer held that the world, despite its suffering, is fundamentally tied to God, and therefore good in its origin. This outlook was central to the Jewish tradition, where creation is presented as the work of a good God, and history itself becomes meaningful under divine providence. In that vision, the world is not an accident or a prison, but the scene in which God's purpose unfolds. Christianity deepened this conviction through the belief that God entered human history in the person of Christ. If God took on flesh, then matter itself could not be evil by nature. The created world, though wounded, retained value. The body could be sanctified. Human life had lasting meaning. The visible world was not something to be escaped in disgust, but something that could be redeemed. The dualist answer was very different. It began by denying that the good God could be responsible for the visible world with all its violence and imperfection. Evil, in this way of thinking, had to come from somewhere else. It was rooted in matter, in the material order itself, which stood opposed to the spiritual realm of light and goodness. In such a system, the universe was divided between two principles. One belonged to God, spirit, unity, and purity. The other belonged to matter, darkness, fragmentation, and corruption. Human beings reflected that division within themselves. The soul came from above, but the body belonged to the lower and evil realm. Life in the flesh became a kind of captivity, and death could be understood not as defeat, but as release. Salvation did not mean the redemption of the body. It meant escape from it. That vision produced a severe moral outlook. If matter was the instrument of evil, then everything that bound the soul more firmly to the material world became suspect. Marriage could be condemned because it led to procreation and therefore trapped more souls in flesh. Food, bodily pleasure, and worldly comfort could be treated as chains. The ideal life became one of restraint, denial, and purification. The goal was not simply self-discipline in the ordinary religious sense, but a radical turning away from the physical world itself. This is why dualist movements so often embraced asceticism with exceptional intensity. Dualism left a deep mark on the history of Europe and of Christianity. Christian thinkers were often forced to define their own teaching more clearly in response to it. At the same time, dualist sects appeared again and again over many centuries, presenting one of the most serious religious challenges faced by both church and state. For a long time, scholars tended to trace systematic dualism back to Persian religious traditions, especially to Zoroastrianism. Modern research has made that direct line much less certain. What now seems far more convincing is that the strongest source of organized dualism was Gnosticism, and above all, Manichaeism, the religion founded by Mani in the 3rd century. Mani's teaching spread astonishingly far. Over the centuries, it moved across vast territories from Asia to the Mediterranean, and later scholarship gained new insight into it after important discoveries of original Manichaean texts in Central Asia and Egypt. In Europe, Manichaean ideas appeared in two major phases. The first spread during late antiquity, reaching regions from Syria and Egypt to North Africa, Italy, and even the centres of Roman and Byzantine Christianity. The second came much later, in the early medieval period, when a revived and reshaped form of dualism moved into southeastern Europe and from there spread across much of the continent. This later current is often described as Neo-Manichaean, and within that broader story, Bogomilism occupies a central position. To understand how Bogomilism emerged, it is necessary to look eastward. The path from early Manichaeism to the medieval Balkans was not simple, but neither was it broken. The religious life of the Near East during the first centuries of the Christian era was crowded with sects, movements, and hybrid traditions. Many of them shared features with Mani's teaching, even if their exact relationship to it is not always easy to prove. But taken together, they reveal a continuity of dualist thought. What helped Manichaeism survive was partly its ability to adapt. Its followers borrowed Christian language and concepts, while some fringe Christian groups absorbed dualist tendencies. In this grey zone between heresy and reinterpretation, older dualist ideas remained alive. Two movements in particular matter for the rise of Bogomilism: the Paulicians and the Massalians. Both flourished in Armenia and Asia Minor, and both shaped the religious climate from which Bogomilism would later emerge. The Paulicians appeared in the 7th century and became especially powerful in the centuries that followed. They were not only a religious problem for Byzantium, but a political one as well. Settled near the empire's eastern frontiers, often armed and sometimes allied with Muslim powers, they became a military threat. Byzantine rulers persecuted them with great force. Their strongholds were destroyed, but their ideas survived. The Paulicians were regarded by Byzantine writers as Manichaeans, and while the label was not entirely precise, it was not baseless either. Their teaching was unmistakably dualist. They believed in a good God and an evil ruler of the present world. The material order was the work of the evil power, while the true God belonged to the age to come. From this followed a rejection of the Old Testament, a hostile view of the institutional church, and a docetic understanding of Christ in which his earthly body was only an appearance. They also gave exceptional honour to St. Paul, which made them stand out even more sharply from the Orthodox world around them. One Byzantine source is especially important because it records that the Paulicians themselves intended to send missionaries to Bulgaria. This detail matters enormously. It suggests that the movement of dualist teaching into the Balkans was not accidental, but deliberate. The Massalians also played a role. They were known from Syria and Asia Minor and shared some beliefs with the Paulicians. Yet they were especially distinctive for their moral teaching. Among them, strict asceticism existed side by side with accusations of antinomian behaviour. Ordinary members could be expected to live with extreme restraint, while those believed to have reached spiritual perfection were sometimes said to stand beyond ordinary moral law. This mixture of intense spirituality and moral instability would later have consequences in the Balkans as well. The spread of Paulicianism into the Balkans was helped by imperial policy itself. Byzantine rulers repeatedly transferred populations from the east into Thrace in order to strengthen the northern frontier. Among those settlers were Syrians and Armenians, and some of them were certainly Paulicians. A Byzantine chronicler explicitly states that these transplanted groups helped spread the heresy in Thrace. From there, the movement could pass more easily into Bulgaria, especially because the Bulgarians frequently invaded the region and eventually took major cities such as Sardica and Philippopolis. Over time, Eastern dualism crossed into Bulgarian lands and began to mix with local conditions in a powerful way. Those local conditions were crucial. Before the official conversion of Bulgaria to Christianity, Paulician teaching may well have seemed more developed and morally serious than the older pagan traditions of the Slavs. Even after Bulgaria accepted Christianity, the country entered a period of religious confusion. Rome and Constantinople struggled fiercely for influence over the newly converted Bulgarians, and the rivalry between Latin and Greek clergy must have left many people uncertain about where religious truth really stood. Such confusion created ideal conditions for a movement that attacked the established church from the outside, while also borrowing from Christian language and scripture. Political and social pressures made the situation even more unstable. The policies of Tsar Simeon, despite their military brilliance, left Bulgaria internally weakened. After his death, Byzantine influence increased sharply. Larger states expanded, taxation became heavier, and discontent grew. During the reign of Tsar Peter, unrest spread through the country, and by the end of the 10th century, Bulgaria was vulnerable to both internal breakdown and foreign invasion. In this setting, the enemies of Byzantium found an audience. The Paulicians were already deeply hostile to the empire, and in Bulgaria, that hostility merged with broader social tensions and resentment toward a church that many ordinary people no longer fully trusted. The Bulgarian church itself was part of the problem. Its higher clergy had become increasingly shaped by Byzantine models and were less closely connected to the people than earlier missionaries had been. Meanwhile, corruption and decline among monks and parish clergy opened the door to criticism. One of the strongest witnesses to this moment was the priest Cosmas, who attacked both the abuses of the church and the spread of Bogomil heresy. His testimony shows that Bogomilism did not arise in a vacuum. It emerged where Eastern dualism met a society already troubled by political weakness, economic strain, religious dissatisfaction, and distrust of ecclesiastical authority. The earliest clear Slavonic witness to the movement appears in Cosmas's sermon against heretics, probably written not long after the year 972. In it, he states that during the reign of the Orthodox Tsar Peter there appeared in Bulgaria a priest named Bogomil, and that this man was the first to preach the new heresy in the land. Almost nothing certain is known about him beyond that. His name is usually understood to mean beloved of God, and from it the movement took the name by which it became famous. By the end of the 10th century or the start of the 11th, his followers were widely known as Bogomils. Cosmas also gives a vivid portrait of how they looked and behaved. Outwardly, they seemed mild, disciplined, and deeply pious. They spoke softly, kept their eyes lowered, avoided loud laughter, and appeared thin from fasting. To many ordinary people, they looked like the very image of holiness. That was one reason for their success. People approached them for guidance, believing they had found men who could show the road to salvation. Their enemies, however, saw all this as disguise. Later, Byzantine writers repeated the same accusation, describing the Bogomils as wolves hidden beneath the clothing and manners of saints. Their teaching centered on the claim that the visible world was not created by the good God, but by the devil. Yet their dualism was somewhat softer in appearance than that of the Paulicians. They did not usually speak of two equal gods. Instead, they described the devil as a rebellious son of God and the brother of Christ. Matter still belonged to evil, but evil itself remained subordinate in the end. This distinction mattered because it gave Bogomil cosmology a more biblical shape, even while it fundamentally undermined Christian teaching. From this worldview followed a rejection of the incarnation, in its ordinary Christian sense. Christ, they taught, only seemed to take flesh. His human life, suffering, and death were not accepted in the full material sense proclaimed by the Church. This was a familiar form of docetism. Because they believed matter could not be a vehicle of grace, they also rejected the sacraments. Baptism, the Eucharist, the cross, churches, miracles, priesthood, and the visible structure of the Church were all denied. In their eyes, these were empty forms, signs of a religion trapped in the material world. Their moral teaching matched their cosmology. If the body belonged to the devil's realm, then the spiritual life required separation from bodily desire. Marriage was condemned. Eating meat and drinking wine were viewed with suspicion. Severe self-denial was praised. It is likely that, as in other dualist movements, there was a distinction between ordinary followers and a more disciplined inner group expected to live in complete continence. What is certain is that even their bitter enemies often admitted the seriousness of their austerity. For a long time, the Bogomils were known for a form of religious purity that seemed harsher than almost anything around them. At the same time, they were not simply ascetics, hiding from the world. They challenged the structure of religious authority itself. They blurred the difference between clergy and laity, favoured a direct approach to scripture, and rejected the elaborate external life of the established church. In some ways, these traits would later remind observers of much later reforming movements in Europe, though the Bogomils were driven by a very different vision of the world. Their ritual life in the early period appears to have been simple. They made wide use of the Lord's Prayer, reciting it many times each day and night with prostrations. They practiced mutual confession, and absolution could be given within the group, even by women. Other church prayers and liturgical forms were dismissed as empty speech. The movement at this stage still seems relatively loose in structure, less formal than it would later become. Bogomilism also had a social edge, and this helped both its appeal and its notoriety. In a world where church and state were closely tied together, rejection of the church easily looked like rebellion against society itself. A movement that condemned marriage and distrusted labour, property and authority could appear deeply subversive. Cosmas accuses the Bogomils of wandering from house to house, living off others, refusing ordinary work, and spreading contempt for rulers, nobles, and masters. He even says they taught servants not to obey their lords. This testimony must be read carefully, because hostile writers often exaggerated. Even so, it is likely that Bogomil preaching at times carried a message of social resistance, especially in defense of the poor against the powerful. That does not make the movement a medieval social revolution in any modern sense. Its first concern remained religious, but its religious ideas could easily spill into the social order and unsettle it. The reaction of church and state was harsh, yet early persecution seems to have helped the Bogomils as much as it hurt them. Imprisonment and repression gave them the aura of martyrs. Their severe appearance, their discipline, and their closeness to ordinary people allowed them to survive. After the end of iconoclasm, Bogomilism became one of the most dangerous religious enemies the Orthodox Church would face in the Middle Ages. Its first and strongest base appears to have been Macedonia. There, the movement took root deeply, and there, many apocryphal and popular writings associated with Bogomil teaching circulated. Place names connected to the group's memory also point in that direction. When Bulgaria fell under Byzantine rule in 1018, the absence of political borders within the empire made further expansion easier. Bogomil ideas spread through Macedonia, Thrace, and beyond. By the middle of the 11th century, there is evidence for Bogomil activity in Thrace, and soon after, signs of it appear across Western Asia Minor as well. It is important not to confuse the Bogomils with the Paulicians, even though the two were clearly related and at times lived side by side. The Paulicians remain more militarized, more aggressive, and often formed self-contained communities that stood apart from Orthodox society. The Bogomils were different. Their ideal was more contemplative, their style more inward and ascetic, and they grew within Balkan society rather than remaining an outside colony. That rootedness among the people helps explain why Bogomilism proved more successful and more enduring in the region. By the late 11th and early 12th centuries, the movement had even reached Constantinople. There, it appears to have gained followers among aristocratic circles. In that environment, its doctrines seem to have become more elaborate and systematic. Byzantine sources from this period describe a fuller cosmology in which Satan, originally a glorious being, rebelled against God, created the visible world with his fallen companions, fashioned the body of Adam, and only then received divine spirit from above to animate human life. In this retelling, the history of Scripture itself was reworked so that much of the older revelation belonged to the deceiver rather than to the true God. Christ then descended into the world in apparent flesh, overcame Satan, and stripped him of his former glory. This was dualism expressed in an increasingly developed and dramatic theological form. The movement also became more organized. By this period, there appear to have been more formal stages of initiation, including a distinction between ordinary believers and the perfect. This development likely came through contact with Byzantine religious structures, even as the Bogomils rejected the church that shaped the world around them. The very sect that condemned hierarchy gradually built one of its own. The imperial authorities responded forcefully. In the early 12th century, a major trial took place in Constantinople. Its most famous victim was the leader Basil, who was publicly executed by burning. The emperor himself took an active part in the proceedings. These actions appear to have weakened the movement in the capital, but they did not destroy it. Outside Constantinople, especially in the provinces, Bogomilism continued to spread. In the 12th century, the centre of gravity shifted back toward Bulgaria and Macedonia. From there, the movement also pushed westward into Serbia. The Serbian ruler Stephen Nemanja felt compelled to summon an assembly to deal with the danger, and the Serbian church worked hard to contain it. In Serbia, the movement never secured the same hold that it did elsewhere. Bosnia, however, proved different. There, a related form of dualist religion, often called the Bosnian or Paterina faith, developed into a broad and distinctive national movement over the centuries that followed. In Bulgaria itself, Bogomilism reached a high point in the early 13th century. A council gathered at Tarnovo in 1211 to confront the heresy. This was one of the most important formal responses made by the Bulgarian Church, and it came at a moment when dualist movements were also under attack in Western Europe. The parallel is striking. Around the same time that church forces in the West were moving against the Albigensians, the Bulgarian authorities were legislating against the Bogomils. The timing hints at a much larger European crisis. The links between Balkan Bogomilism and Western Catharism remain complex, but the evidence for contact is strong. Medieval Western opponents sometimes described Catharism as the heresy of the Bulgars. Certain ritual practices appear to have travelled from the Balkans into Italy and southern France. Some of the doctrinal writings used by Western dualists also point back toward a Balkan origin. By the beginning of the 13th century, dualist communities across southern Europe may well have formed a loose international network stretching from the Black Sea to the Atlantic. That does not mean they were controlled by a single leader in the Balkans, as some Western writers imagined. But it does suggest regular exchange, influence, and shared identity across great distances. The council at Tarnovo condemned the Bogomils, but the movement survived. Later, complaints from the papacy show that Bulgaria was still seen as full of heretics, yet the seeds of decline had already been planted. Bogomalism was strong partly because it was flexible and adaptable, but that same fluidity eventually weakened it. Over time, it absorbed elements from other sects, especially from the Massilians, and not all of those borrowings were healthy. The movement that had once been known for strict moral discipline gradually became associated in some places with moral disorder and sexual license. This was a profound change, and it damaged the authority that had once made the Bogomils so attractive. In 14th century Bulgaria, this decline became impossible to ignore. Religious leaders now often spoke of the Bogomils and the Massilians together, as though the two had almost fused into one. The old image of severe purity had faded. At the same time, Bulgaria itself was weakening under political and social strain. In such conditions, the sect lost cohesion. It no longer possessed the moral clarity or inner discipline that had sustained it in earlier centuries. The final stage came with the collapse of the Bulgarian state before the advance of the Ottoman Turks. By then, Bogomalism was already in decline. After the fall of the Second Bulgarian Empire, the movement seems to have disintegrated rather than facing one last great suppression. Some of its followers may have found accommodation with the new rulers, and even accepted Islam, though the details remain uncertain. What is clear is that, with the establishment of Ottoman rule across southeastern Europe, the Bogomils disappear from history. The story of St. Demetrius is inseparable from the story of Thessaloniki, but its importance reaches far beyond a single city. Over time, the saint's cult became one of the clearest ways to observe a much larger historical process: the spread of Byzantine religious culture into the Slavic world of Eastern Europe. What began as the devotion of one great Byzantine city eventually became part of the spiritual and political imagination of peoples far beyond the Aegean. Through that development, the figure of Demetrius moved from local protector to a symbol whose meaning could be adapted, admired, and even contested across the medieval Balkans and beyond. The relationship between Byzantium and the Slavs can be understood as unfolding in three broad stages. The first began in the late 6th century and lasted into the early 9th. This was a time of crisis for the empire, when the Balkans were shaken by the repeated attacks of Slavs, Avars, and later Bulgars. During those long and violent generations, Byzantium struggled simply to survive. Much of the inland Balkan world slipped from imperial control, either permanently or for long stretches of time, and many regions of Greece itself faced settlement and disruption. Yet the empire endured because it managed to hold on to its major coastal strongholds. Above all, Constantinople and Thessaloniki remained in Byzantine hands. Their survival was not just a military fact. It became a spiritual statement as well. In the defense of Thessaloniki, the cult of St. Demetrius played a role of extraordinary importance. The city's people believed that their patron was not a distant heavenly figure, but an active protector who stood with them during their darkest hours. That conviction became part of the city's identity and shaped the memory of the sieges that threatened its existence. In the literary tradition devoted to the saint, the great attacks of the late 6th and 7th centuries are remembered not merely as military struggles, but as moments in which divine protection was visibly at work. Demetrius was seen as the guardian of the city, the one who preserved it when destruction seemed close. The second stage in Byzantine-Slav relations began in the early 9th century and continued into the late 12th. This was an age of recovery and outward movement for Byzantium. The empire reasserted itself, and the church played a major role in that resurgence. In Greece, Slavic populations that had settled in earlier centuries were gradually absorbed into the religious and cultural world of Byzantium. Farther north, outside the empire's direct borders, Byzantine Christianity began to spread with remarkable force. During the 9th century, Bulgarians, Serbs, and Russians entered the orbit of Eastern Christian civilization. It was in this period that the Byzantine mission to the Slavs reached one of its highest points, especially through the work of Cyril and Methodius. Their efforts did far more than introduce a new religion. They opened the way for an entire written culture rooted in Byzantine tradition, but expressed in a Slavic language. The third stage belongs to the later Middle Ages. By then, Byzantine civilization still carried great prestige across Eastern Europe, but the empire itself was weakening. New powers in the Balkans and beyond began to imagine that the centre of Christian authority might one day move away from Constantinople. Rulers and courts in Slavic lands increasingly adopted Byzantine models not only to imitate them, but also to rival them. Some came to imagine their own capitals as heirs to the sacred and imperial role once claimed by Byzantium. In this changing political landscape, the symbolic world connected to Constantinople could be transferred elsewhere. The same was true of Thessaloniki. If one could imagine a new Rome outside the empire, it was not difficult to imagine a new Thessaloniki as well. Since Demetrius was bound so closely to his city, his cult could also be moved, reinterpreted, and claimed in foreign lands. The earliest and most dramatic phase of this story centres on the defence of Thessaloniki itself. One of the most important texts for understanding that world is the collection of miracle narratives devoted to Saint Demetrius. These writings are of enormous value not only because they preserve the religious atmosphere of the time, but also because they contain rare and detailed information about warfare, urban life, and the social world of the Balkans during a period of near constant danger. Few medieval works bring a besieged city to life so vividly. They show the streets, the walls, the fears of the population, the military pressure from outside, and above all the emotional certainty that the city survived because its heavenly protector intervened. The first part of this collection was written in the early 7th century by John, Archbishop of Thessaloniki. A later continuation was composed several decades afterward. Together, these texts provide an unusually rich picture of one of the most unstable periods in early medieval Balkan history. They describe the defensive structure of the city, the mechanics of siege warfare, and the movements of northern invaders who pressed down through river valleys and across mountain passes toward the warm and wealthy coastal lands of the Aegean. These groups sought permanent footholds in the south, and Thessaloniki was one of the great prizes they could never fully grasp. In these accounts, Saint Demetrius is not simply invoked in prayer. He appears as an active force in battle. During one great siege, the saint is said to have shown himself on the walls in the form of a warrior. He strikes down an attacker who has begun climbing the defences, strengthens the hearts of the defenders, and fills the enemy with fear. The salvation of the city is presented as his work. In later episodes, he appears dressed in white, encircling the fortifications, walking upon the sea to terrify hostile fleets, or guarding the gates on horseback. These scenes gave form to a belief that the fate of Thessaloniki was tied directly to its patron saint. The miracle stories did not merely entertain pious readers. They reinforced the city's confidence that it lived under supernatural protection. The Basilica of Saint Demetrius stood at the centre of that devotion. Over time, it became one of the great shrines of the Eastern Christian world. Its history in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages is complex, but for the medieval cult, what mattered most was its role as the focal point of the saint's living presence. The miracle narratives record that the church suffered a devastating fire and was rebuilt in splendid form. Even after destruction, it endured as the sacred heart of the city. This continuity was crucial. The basilica was not simply a monument. It was the place where Thessaloniki encountered its protector. The surviving mosaics associated with the church add another dimension to this story. Some belong to an earlier phase, while others were created after the rebuilding. Among the most famous are images that place Saint Demetrius beside figures linked to the restoration of the basilica and in the company of children. These works have long fascinated scholars because they bring together devotion, civic memory, and artistic expression. What is especially striking is the way they contribute to the transformation of Demetrius into a military saint. Earlier traditions present him with the dignity of a noble figure, but over time he comes increasingly to be shown in armour, carrying weapons, and standing as a defender of the Christian city. The literary and visual traditions worked together in shaping that image. The language used by the writers who praised him reveals the same shift. Demetrius was described as the lover of his fatherland, the saviour of his city, its guardian, its victorious champion. These titles suggest more than piety. They place him in a civic and military role that mirrored the needs of the age. Thessaloniki was not protected only by walls, soldiers, and strategy. It was protected by a heavenly patron who fought for it. This idea placed the city's experience alongside that of Constantinople itself, where devotion to the Mother of God served a similar purpose. In an age when the empire was under great pressure, such beliefs strengthened the conviction that Byzantium's survival was inseparable from divine favour. After the turmoil of the earlier centuries, Byzantium entered a new era of confidence. The end of the iconoclastic controversy allowed the Church to turn more fully toward missionary work, and that work transformed the Slavic world. The mission of Cyril and Methodius stands at the heart of this development. Their arrival in Central Europe in the 9th century had consequences far beyond the immediate success of their preaching. By creating a Slavic, written language suitable for liturgy and scripture, they opened an entirely new channel through which Byzantine Christianity could be transmitted. This language, later known as Old Church Slavonic, would remain central to the spiritual and literary life of Orthodox Slavs for centuries. The connection between Cyril and Methodius and the cult of Saint Demetrius was not only cultural, but deeply personal. Both brothers came from Thessaloniki. They grew up in a city where the saint's presence shaped public memory, local identity, and religious life. Wherever they went, they carried that inheritance with them. Even in distant lands, during disputes with hostile clergy and amid the many hardships of mission, they continued to think of the Byzantine world as home. For men formed by Thessaloniki, Demetrius could not be left behind. He remained a figure of comfort and support even far from the city whose fate he had once guarded. This appears most clearly in the tradition connected with Methodius. Near the end of his life, after years of struggle in Central Europe and after the completion of major translation work, he is said to have celebrated the liturgy on the feast of Saint Demetrius. That gesture was deeply meaningful. His mission had been consumed by conflict, especially with those who opposed the use of the Slavic language in worship. To honour Demetrius at such a moment was to place the entire labour of evangelizing the Slavs under the patronage of the Saint of Thessaloniki. It suggested that the work of bringing scripture and liturgy to the Slavic peoples belonged within the wider world of Byzantine Christian tradition from which both brothers came. An even more moving witness survives in an early Slavic hymn to St. Demetrius, often connected with Methodius himself. The text is liturgical, yet behind its formal structure one can hear unmistakable emotion. It speaks in the voice of men far from home, separated from the radiant church of their native city, longing to stand once more in its sanctuary. At the same time, it carries a note of struggle. The writers present themselves as labouring in foreign lands, engaged in a difficult fight for the truth of their mission. In that combination of homesickness and defiance, the figure of Demetrius becomes more than a patron saint. He becomes a bond between Thessaloniki and the distant lands where Byzantine Christianity was taking root in Slavic form. Through the work of Cyril, Methodius, and their disciples, the cult of St. Demetrius spread widely among the Bulgarians, Serbs, and Russians. It moved through texts, liturgy, pilgrimage, and political symbolism. Several cities played important roles in that process. Ohrid in Macedonia became a leading center of Slavic Christianity after the collapse of the Moravian mission. Other places in the Balkans also contributed to the spread of the saint's veneration. Yet above all, Thessaloniki itself remained the great source. Its basilica drew pilgrims from across the Orthodox world. For many Slavs, visiting the Church of St. Demetrius was an experience comparable, in emotional and spiritual intensity, to visiting the holy places of Jerusalem or the great sanctuaries of Constantinople. Part of the attraction lay in the belief that healing myrrh flowed from the relics of the saint. This holy substance was thought to possess protective and curative power, and pilgrims carried it back to their own countries. Inside the basilica, they honoured the saint at the silver ciborium associated in popular devotion with his burial place. The building itself, the relics, the ritual environment, and the miracle tradition all combined to make Thessaloniki one of the great sacred destinations of the medieval Eastern Christian world. Among the Slavs, the earliest clear signs of Demetrius's veneration appear in the late 9th century. In the Bulgarian lands of Macedonia, Clement of Ohrid composed a work in his honour. Though modest in style, it shows that the saint had already entered the literary and devotional life of the Slavic Church. There, as elsewhere, he was praised as a glorious martyr and as the steadfast support of his homeland. This language reflects the same themes found in the Greek tradition, but now expressed within a Slavic environment shaped by Byzantine mission. In medieval Serbia, the cult of St. Demetrius found strong visual expression. Wall paintings in important churches show scenes from the saint's life and miracles, especially his role as the defender of Thessaloniki. These images depict him pushing back enemies from the walls and intervening in moments of danger. What is remarkable is that Serbian artists preserved episodes connected to the earlier struggles of Byzantium against northern invaders, even though the Serbs themselves were among the peoples who had once stood on the other side of that conflict. The result is striking. A Slavic Christian culture adopted and celebrated images in which the saint protects a Byzantine city from Slavic attackers. That fact says much about the world created by Byzantine Christianity. It was a commonwealth of culture and faith in which sacred memory could rise above simple ethnic hostility. The Russian case is equally revealing. The name of St. Demetrius became deeply rooted in Rus and remained popular across many layers of society. It was borne by princes and associated with major dynastic figures. One ruler of Kiev founded a monastery in honor of the saint, hoping it would rival the most important monastic centers of the land. Seals connected with princely power depict Demetrius standing as a heavenly protector. Later, in the powerful principality of Vladimir Suzdal, a grand cathedral was erected in his honor. This church stands among the finest achievements of medieval Russian architecture, and its dedication shows how fully the saint had been incorporated into the sacred and political imagination of Rus. Russian devotion to Demetrius was not confined to names and buildings. It was also expressed through local literature and through comparison with native saints. In early Russian tradition, the princely martyrs Boris and Gleb became symbols of innocent suffering and heavenly intercession. Their cult was at the center of the spiritual identity of Kievan Rus. Yet one writer, praising them, compared their protection of the Russian land to the way Demetrius had fought for Thessaloniki. Another went even further and described the town associated with Boris and Gleb as a second Thessaloniki. That was an extraordinary claim. It shows that the shrine of St. Demetrius had become a model so powerful that medieval Russians sought to reproduce it symbolically within their own land. To call a Russian town a new Thessaloniki was to place it within the sacred geography of Byzantium itself. This desire to mirror Thessaloniki would become even more significant in later centuries, especially as Slavic rulers and writers began to imagine their own lands as possible heirs to Byzantium. Once the idea emerged that the political and spiritual centre of the Christian world might be transferred from Constantinople to another capital, the same logic could be applied to the empire's second city. Thessaloniki, too, could be imitated, symbolically replaced, or claimed through devotion to its saint. In some cases, this went beyond imitation and turned into a more dramatic claim. Saint Demetrius could be imagined as leaving his old city behind and extending his favour to those who were now rising against Byzantine power. Such ideas belong to a world in which sacred authority and political ambition were closely connected. A city under the protection of Demetrius did not merely possess a revered patron. It possessed a sign of legitimacy, a link to the prestige of Byzantium, and a share in the memory of Thessaloniki's heroic past. That is why the cult of the saint cannot be reduced to religious devotion alone. It became part of the wider transfer of Byzantine civilization into the Slavic world. Through liturgy, literature, art, pilgrimage, and political symbolism, Demetrius crossed borders and acquired new meanings. Among the Slavic traditions connected with Saint Demetrius, one stands out for its unusual and almost legendary character. It tells of a pagan war leader who once tried, unsuccessfully, to capture Thessaloniki. During the campaign, he seized 2 young women and carried them far from their homeland. In his camp, he spoke of the famous protector of the city, a saint whose miracles were widely known even beyond the borders of Byzantium. He ordered the captives to create an image of this holy figure, believing that if he could carry it before his army, it might grant him victory in future battles. At first, the 2 women refused. They feared that such a request was meant to dishonor the saint, but under the threat of death, they had no choice but to obey. When the image was finally completed, they fell asleep in sorrow, convinced that they had been forced into an act of betrayal. What followed belonged entirely to the world of miracle and belief. During the night, St. Demetrius himself intervened. The 2 captives were suddenly carried away from their captor and returned to Thessaloniki. The image they had made remained beside the saint's resting place, as if to confirm that his power could not be misused by those who opposed him. The structure of this story carries clear traces of folklore. It moves between fear, coercion, and sudden salvation, using familiar elements of oral storytelling. That may explain why it later found its way into popular religious poetry. In Russia, travelling singers preserved similar tales in songs passed down over generations. In one version, the embroidered image becomes something even more fantastical. It turns into a magical object capable of flight. With the aid of the saint and the force of the wind, the 2 women escape through the air, leaving behind the danger that threatened them. In that same poetic tradition, Saint Demetrius does not remain a distant protector. He rises directly from his tomb to confront the enemy. Mounted not on a war horse but on a white donkey, he defeats the attackers and restores safety to the city. The image is unusual, but it carries symbolic weight. It blends humility with power, reinforcing the idea that victory comes not through ordinary strength, but through divine intervention. In these songs, the identity of the enemy also changes. The besieging force is no longer an anonymous group of invaders. It becomes associated with a well-known historical figure, a Tatar leader whose defeat by a Russian prince marked a turning point in Russian history. By merging a miracle story with a real military victory, the tradition reshapes the past, linking local memory to a broader narrative of struggle and triumph. This blending of legend and history reveals how deeply the figure of St. Demetrius entered the imagination of the Slavic world. His story was not simply repeated, it was adapted, expanded, and placed into new settings. Through that process, the saint became a figure who could cross time and space, appearing wherever his presence seemed meaningful. In earlier centuries, the Slavs had already created symbolic connections between their own sacred figures and the traditions of Thessaloniki. By linking their native saints with Demetrius, they constructed a kind of spiritual reflection of his city within their own lands. But such reflections could evolve. Under certain conditions, they could begin to challenge the original model rather than simply imitate it. This shift becomes visible when political ambition enters the picture. As the medieval Slavic states grew stronger, some of their rulers began to claim not only cultural inheritance from Byzantium, but also a form of succession. The idea emerged that the authority once centered in Constantinople could be transferred elsewhere. This belief was not limited to imperial titles or political power. It also extended into the religious sphere. If a city could inherit the role of Constantinople, then perhaps it could also claim the protection of saints who had once belonged to the Byzantine world. The notion that Saint Demetrius might abandon Thessaloniki and assist others appears to have taken shape in moments of conflict. One early example comes from a failed attempt to capture the city during the 11th century. During the siege, the defenders spent the night praying at the saint's tomb and anointing themselves with the sacred oil believed to flow from his relics. When battle resumed, the attackers later claimed to have seen a mysterious warrior leading the defenders, striking them down with supernatural force. The people of Thessaloniki understood this figure as their patron saint, intervening once again to save his city. For those who had suffered defeat, such an event could be interpreted in another way. If the saint's power determined the outcome of battles, then perhaps that power could be claimed or redirected. The desire to draw such a figure onto one's own side was not surprising. It offered both hope in war and a sense of divine approval. One of the earliest attempts to reinterpret the role of Saint Demetrius appears in a surprising context. A Russian narrative describes a campaign against Constantinople long before the conversion of the Rus to Christianity. In that account, the Byzantine defenders, faced with danger, are said to have believed that the attacking leader was not an ordinary man, but a manifestation of the saint himself, sent by God. The story is striking, not only because it places a pagan warrior in the role of a Christian protector, but also because it reflects a blending of traditions that may have passed through multiple cultural layers. Some scholars have suggested that such stories may have originated in the storytelling traditions of northern warriors who had served in the Byzantine world and carried fragments of its legends back with them. A more direct and historically grounded example comes from Bulgaria in the late 12th century. At that time, a revolt broke out against Byzantine rule. The leaders of the uprising sought not only military success, but also spiritual legitimacy. To strengthen their cause, they built a church dedicated to Saint Demetrius in their own capital and declared that the saint had abandoned Thessaloniki and come to support their struggle. This claim had a powerful psychological effect. It suggested that divine favour had shifted, that the protector of a great Byzantine city now stood with those who opposed the empire. The timing of this claim made it even more effective. Thessaloniki had recently suffered a major defeat, and its prestige had been shaken. In such a moment, the idea that its patron saint had departed would have seemed plausible to those seeking encouragement. The narrative did not need to be fully believed to be useful. It served its purpose by strengthening morale and reinforcing the legitimacy of rebellion. The Byzantines, for their part, responded in kind. When a later attack threatened Thessaloniki, the sudden death of the opposing ruler was attributed to the direct action of Saint Demetrius. According to the story, the saint appeared as a warrior and struck him down before the final assault could take place. Whether accepted or doubted, such accounts reveal how deeply the figure of the saint had become intertwined with warfare, politics, and identity. These episodes might suggest a rivalry over the saint, a competition among different peoples to claim his support. Yet, it would be misleading to take this too far. In most cases, such claims were temporary and shaped by specific political needs. When war broke out, it was natural for each side to seek divine favour. Invoking Saint Demetrius was one way to do so. But beneath these shifting claims, a deeper and more stable belief remained. For all the attempts to appropriate him, Saint Demetrius was still understood as belonging above all to Thessaloniki. His presence was tied to his shrine, to the basilica where his relics were honoured, and to the traditions that had grown around his name. Slavic pilgrims continued to travel to the city, drawn by its reputation as a sacred place. In their own churches, they depicted his victories, even when those victories had been won against their ancestors. They gave him titles that linked him directly to his city, emphasizing his identity as the protector of Thessaloniki. The belief in the healing and protective power of the substance associated with his relics became especially strong. Pilgrims carried it back to their homelands, where it was used in rituals and even, in some cases, as a substitute for other sacred elements. Such practices show how firmly the saint's authority remained rooted in his original setting, even as his influence spread outward. In the end, the efforts to claim Saint Demetrius for different causes reveal less about rivalry and more about the complexity of medieval thought. The Slavic peoples who adopted Byzantine Christianity inherited not only its doctrines, but also its symbols and its sacred geography. They could admire and imitate the traditions of Thessaloniki, while at the same time adapting them to their own needs. They could imagine the saint fighting for them in one moment, and still recognize his primary place in another. This dual perspective reflects a broader pattern. In politics, as in religion, the Slavic world both depended on and reinterpreted the legacy of Byzantium. Its rulers might dream of replacing the empire, yet they continued to acknowledge its central role. Its saints could be honoured locally, yet their origins were never entirely forgotten. The cult of Saint Demetrius embodies this balance. It shows how a single figure could unite different lands through shared belief, while also becoming a symbol shaped by local identity and historical change. Beyond these specific examples, the wider setting in which such cultural exchanges took place must also be considered. The regions along the borders of Byzantium formed a complex and shifting landscape. They were not simple dividing lines between one world and another. Instead, they were zones of contact where ideas, goods, and people moved in multiple directions. Some of these border regions lay in the Balkans, others along the Danube, the Black Sea, and the steppe lands stretching toward the north and east. Each had its own character, shaped by geography, climate, and the societies that inhabited them. These frontier areas were rarely fixed. Political boundaries shifted, sometimes rapidly, and even when they appeared stable, they often represented only an ideal rather than a reality. A line drawn on a map might suggest a clear separation, but in practice, movement across it continued. Trade, warfare, migration, and diplomacy all blurred the distinction between inside and outside. In some cases, the empire's influence extended far beyond its official borders. In others, areas within its territory remained only loosely connected to its authority. Geography played a major role in shaping these interactions. Forests could act as barriers, limiting movement and preserving distinct ways of life. Mountains could isolate communities or protect them from invasion, but they could also channel movement through passes and valleys. Rivers might divide regions, yet at the same time serve as routes for communication and trade. Climate also mattered. The transition from Mediterranean to continental conditions created zones where adaptation was necessary and where cultural change often followed environmental realities. Within these frontier spaces, cultural exchange took many forms. Warfare was one of the most direct. Opponents learned from each other, adopting tactics, weapons, and strategies. Economic interaction was equally important. Goods moved across borders, along with money and skills. In some regions, nomadic and settled ways of life influenced one another, leading either to the spread of agriculture or the persistence of pastoral traditions. Religious influence was perhaps the most lasting form of exchange. Byzantine Christianity spread outward, carried by missionaries, traders, and political alliances. Yet influence did not move in only one direction. Ideas from neighbouring cultures also entered the empire, sometimes shaping internal debates and developments. In certain regions, especially along unstable borders, mixed communities emerged. These groups combined elements from different traditions, creating identities that could not easily be defined as entirely Byzantine or entirely foreign. In such environments, it was possible for individuals to move between worlds. Some adopted the customs of their neighbours, while others acted as intermediaries, carrying knowledge and practices from one side to the other. These frontier societies were neither fully controlled nor completely separate. They were places of interaction where cultural boundaries could be crossed and redefined.